Today we're looking at the Americas, and we're going to look at the Americas just before the arrival and the subsequent invasion by the Europeans. So we're going to start with the Valley of Mexico, and we're going to look at the Aztecs, but before we get into the Aztecs, we're going to look briefly at another group called the Toltecs. First off, before we dig deep into the Toltecs, we don't know as much information about the Toltecs. There's not a whole lot left over about their civilization. But what we do know is that they're going to move into Central America from the north. And so they're going to encompass kind of the Valley of Mexico and through the northern parts of Central America. And they're going to move in as the Mayan city-states begin to decline. And they create a very strong military ethic. This included an emphasis on human sacrifice and warfare as well. Their religion, aspects of their religion are going to be passed on to the Aztecs, including the belief in a feathered serpent called Quetzalcoatl, who we'll talk more about with the Aztec religion in a little bit. And they take over many of the Mayan cities or allow the Mayans to keep their cities, but under Toltec control. And they're going to kind of dominate this region until around 1150, when other groups of nomads move into the area and disrupt their civilization. And so this is going to lead to a period of kind of chaos in the Valley of Mexico. And during this period, many groups were struggling and fighting over the land, but also especially over control of the lakes. And so the Aztecs, who called themselves the Mexica, are going to move into central Mexico around 1325. And so at the time, this is an area that was divided into many different tribes and many different city-states. And the Aztecs were known for being great fighters. And they originally were brought in basically as mercenaries. Other tribes would hire them as mercenaries. And they're going to eventually kind of establish their own base on an island on Lake Texcoco, which will eventually become Tenochtitlan. And this kind of served as their secure base as they continued to struggle for territory. And so eventually the Aztecs are going to emerge as winners of this power struggle. They're going to join an alliance with two other cities to create this triple alliance that ultimately was dominated by the Aztecs. And they didn't really create a large bureaucracy. Instead, they're going to create a tribute empire. And so we'll talk more about this tribute system in a little bit, but basically as long as the conquered peoples agreed to pay tribute to the Aztecs, they pretty much allowed a lot of local autonomy. And so they built a capital at Tenochtitlan on Lake Texcoco. And this is going to serve as kind of the secure base of the Aztecs. This becomes their capital city. They had many gardens. They even had a zoo, large two-story houses as well. And then to help feed their population, they're going to create these floating agricultural islands called chinampas. And I have an image here in the lower right-hand corner of those chinampas. What these chinampas were floating agricultural islands. And they were made up of cane to kind of create a base and reed, and then they filled it with mud. Some of that mud pulled up from the bottom of the lake. And so it created a very fertile soil. They even planted willow trees to kind of provide shade. And then they would plant crops on these floating agricultural islands. And it helped feed the capital. So the Aztecs are going to continue to expand. They're going to push into modern-day southwest Mexico along the Gulf Coast and eventually come to control most of that Valley of Mexico. And as I said earlier, they didn't really rule directly. They would conquer territories, but instead they set up this tribute relationship. And tribute came in various forms. Usually it came in the form of agriculture surplus, maybe in the form of manufactured items, but also human sacrifice victims. And we'll look more at that when we look at the Aztec religion. But they allowed local rulers to keep their power as long as they agreed to pay this tribute. When we look at the Aztec social system, there was a noble aristocracy at the very top, but underneath that was a kind of warrior aristocracy. And a lot of prestige and honor was given to this military class. And commoners could prove themselves on the battlefield, so it was possible, not very likely, but it was at least possible for common peoples to prove themselves on the battlefield and work their way up into this warrior aristocracy class. Nobles had a key advantage, though, when it came to this social system because they could afford better weapons and they could devote more time to training. And so this warrior class was supported with land and tribute from the commoners. Underneath that was a priest class. And the priest class was responsible for similar things to priests in other civilizations. They oversaw ceremonies. They also were responsible for interpreting the gods' wishes and ensuring that the gods remained happy. And then most of the population was made up of cultivators. And so most of the population worked on land. And that's one of the main ways that the Aztec economy operated. It was an agricultural economy. And so peasants worked on the land and provided food to support the other classes like this warrior aristocracy class. And then merchants. There was a merchant class in the Aztec civilization, and this is a key difference when we look at the Aztec versus the Inca. The Inca aren't going to have a merchant class, but the Aztecs did. And so this merchant class helped control markets. They did specialize in long-distance trade, but they also served some other roles as well. Merchants also provided military intelligence, and they also served as spies, and they also collected tribute from neighboring peoples. When we look at the role of women in the Aztec civilization, there really wasn't a large public role for women. This is a kind of warrior society, and so women's public role was rather limited. Women could gain influence as mothers, but pretty much all women were expected to marry. And another thing that kind of kept women confined to the home was a lack of technology. And we're going to look more at this at the end of this presentation. But women had to dedicate a large amount of time to food production. They could spend upwards of 6 hours a day just grinding corn and preparing food. And so that's another reason, another thing that kind of kept them somewhat confined to the household. Aztec religion. Aztec religion is interesting. First off, they practice a basic polytheistic religion. And the religion serves several purposes. First off, the religion helped unify the Aztecs. And it helped kind of keep the population in check. And it combined many secular and sacred aspects. And so they had over 128 major deities, major gods. And most of these gods had both a male and female form. And they had yearly festivals dedicated to the gods, yearly ceremonies dedicated to the gods. And when we look at these 128 deities, there were three major themes of these gods. There were gods of fertility and agriculture. So this includes things like your gods of rain and corn and fertility. There were also gods of creation, as well as gods of warfare and sacrifice. And so human sacrifice was another pretty major aspect of Aztec religion. Sacrifices were basically used to appease the gods and to feed the gods and keep them happy. There's also examples of cannibalism in the Aztec society as well. And so this use of human sacrifice was another tool, another use of terror to help ensure Aztec power.